The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Can grief be cured? It may be an odd question, but for those suffering through loss, it's a real debate. We'll explore that tonight. Then we'll examine the growing social media trend of what's called trauma dumping and ask whether it's doing more harm than good. It's Monday, October 17th, and that's tonight on The Agenda. After a profound loss, grief can not only feel overwhelming and endless, for some, it also really does not ease off over time. That is increasingly being referred to as, quote, prolonged grief disorder, and it's regarded as a medical condition. Does that help? And does it suggest there is, or should be, a cure for grief? Let's find out. We're joined in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Cassandra Glenn. She's a licensed master social worker. In Montreal, Quebec, Kendra McLaughlin, public health researcher, writer, and activist. In London, Ontario, Carrie Arnold, assistant professor in the thanatology department at Western's King's University College. And here in the provincial capital in Etobicoke, Carmen Galvin, co-founder of BIPOC Death and Grief Talk. And we're very glad that all four of you could spare some time for us on TVO tonight. I want to just get each of you to weigh in on the main question of the night, which is, can grief actually be cured? And then we'll go from there. Cassandra, start us off, if you would.
Sure, absolutely. My briefest answer to that question is no. It's not so cut and dry that it is something that happens and then can eventually be cured. My belief that I hold in that is that it is an experience to be integrated. It becomes part of our lives rather than something that we experience and then get over. And the ways that we learn to hold space for that and actually integrate that into our lives can make a big difference in how we move forward and make meaning out of experiences in the future.
Kendra, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I don't see grief as a disease or a disorder. I see it rather as a universal human experience that needs to have social, interpersonal, and political support.
Carrie.
I agree with what's been said so far. I think if we start to use language around grief symptoms or can grief be cured, we are then sort of supporting this current cultural narrative that grief is an illness or a disease. And we know that it isn't. And so grief isn't a biomedical sort of issue to resolve. It is a naturally occurring event in response to loss that is situated in our current socio-political norms of this time. And so I think we need to be mindful of not pathologizing or medicalizing a normative experience that all of us will encounter.
Carmen.
Yes, I 100% agree with all of the speakers. I do not believe, and we do not believe, that it is something that can be cured. It is a universal experience. What we like to tell our participants is that it is a biological imperative to creating attachments to various folks and various things. And we do not believe in pathologizing that universal experience that we all go through.
Okay, so Cassandra, I'm coming back to you now. I guess I'm seeing 4 no votes for pathologizing grief. Why do you think the attempt to do so seems to be so powerful at the moment?
Well, I think the attempt to do so seems so powerful because we really live in structures and systems that want to make things cut and dry. They want to pathologize everything. And so in that search for certainty, from making things black and white, can we give this a diagnosis? Can we make it this set of experiences that we can then get over? And because we are in such a diagnosis-centered society, there are social benefits to providing some sort of diagnosis. That doesn't come anywhere near the nuance of everybody's individual experience, particularly in grief and loss.
Kendra, needless to say, over the last 2.5 years, people have experienced grief in probably newer, more profound and different ways than they had because of COVID-19. Can you tell us, in your view, how you think the last 2.5 years have shaped our understanding of grief?
Well, I think what it really has brought to the fore, COVID has brought to the fore, is that it is indeed a human experience, a normal human experience that increasingly more people are experiencing at the same time. And I think in a society where we're often reduced to our roles of productivity and competition, and where grief is seen as a threat to those social norms, there's a pressure to alleviate this pause on productivity that grief presents through things like diagnoses. So I think it's a convenient response to a time in which a lot of people are being affected in terms of productivity because of a lot of grief that is happening.
Carrie, I must confess the word thanatology was not part of my vocabulary before I met you 5 minutes ago. You're part of the Loss Lab at the Thanatology Department at King's College University in London. This, I gather, is the study of death and losses. Can you sort of give us a better understanding of what the importance of the study of this is in academia these days?
Sure. So as you mentioned, thanatology is the study of death, dying, grief, and loss, and comes from the Greek word thanatos. And so it holds all things related to death and grief, as well as how to live fully knowing that our time here is finite. And so the academic study of thanatology is relatively recent, maybe starting out with Freud's sort of seminal work on mourning and melancholia. And that launched this conversation between what is depression versus grief and mourning. And so interestingly enough, this thanatology program at King's is one of the only undergraduate programs that we know of globally. I think there are a few master's programs in the States. I don't know of any PhD programs. And so thanatology really is quite a unique discipline in that it touches all aspects of our lives. There isn't any discipline that wouldn't be affected, from green burials to medical assistance in dying, understanding suicide, palliative care, our aging population. So there are so many intersecting societal realities, even the unrest that we're seeing around the world in terms of oppressive regimes. Everything comes back to this, necropolitics. So equipping our students with how to resolve some of these or address some of these complex issues is really important.
And I think the people who run your post-secondary institution would probably like it if I called it by its proper name. I think I got it backwards there. King's University College, yes?
Yes.
There we go. Okay. I can be taught eventually. Okay, Carmen, let me get you in here now. You're the co-founder of a grassroots collective, BIPOC Grief and Death Talk. I gather you run monthly workshops on Zoom. Give us a sense of how those work and what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of what we do is related to enfranchising disenfranchised grief within racialized communities. And what that looks like is we hold talks where we work from a perspective of decolonializing, like decolonizing, and really confronting this idea of the professional kind of helping professions, I guess. And we come together collectively as a group. We are all on the same page. We all share our stories of grief and loss. And it is a great healing space for folks who are racialized, for marginalized communities, to really have that conversation about grief, not just in the perspective of losing somebody significant, but also that we all don't live in a vacuum. We don't live in a vacuum. A lot of us are dealing with the loss of land, the loss of our abilities, especially with COVID. It's been huge, kind of long COVID, and kind of our loss of our abilities as human beings, our loss of power. Also, something we noticed during COVID was just the amount of racial trauma that was really coming out, and how that in itself cannot be separated from when we lose people, and how that can really complicate what grief looks like. And there's not enough spaces where people get to have those conversations in a space where they're not being pathologized, where they're not being spoken at, and where they feel like, okay, I'm just a patient. This is really about collective care and community support. And so that is basically our goal, is to support everyone through that.
And let me do a quick follow-up with you, because you used a word there that we are hearing more and more these days, but I'm not sure everybody knows what it means when they hear it. Decolonizing. Give us a sense about what that means and what does it look like in real life?
Yeah, so for us, it's really about confronting. So obviously, what a lot of people think decolonizing looks like would be kind of doing a land acknowledgement, and that's it. But for us, it's really about going way past the land acknowledgement. It's about acknowledging the fact that we can have these discussions and really bring in our own ancestral knowledge. For example, for myself, I am Mexican. I am an immigrant to Canada. And so we all have our own ancestral knowledge that has been really, in a lot of ways, taken from us quite violently. And this is a space where we can kind of talk about how do we reconnect with them? How do we reconnect with ourselves? And how do we really challenge these kind of white supremacists' understandings of grief? And you can see it in policies, you can see it in bereavement leave, you can see it in all sorts of different things, how it permeates. And so our job is to sit there and let people kind of talk about their frustrations about that without trying to correct anyone, without trying to make it professional, without having to sit there and have an agenda and have, you know, breakout rooms and all these other things. It's just about people coming as they are, which we feel is very anti-colonial, because so much of colonization is just everybody having to have control over their emotions, over everything, so as to not disturb the folks around them. And so we believe in doing things a little differently.
I want to get Cassandra in on that, because you're in New Mexico right now, which is, well, you know, we haven't got time to go chapter and verse into the history of relations between settler culture and indigenous people in New Mexico, but maybe you can tell me whether what you're doing and what Carmen is doing, whether they're different.
So my background is as a social worker. And so I really believe in all of the values that Carmen is expressing. And I think that a lot of that sort of nuance that she is talking about really shows up here in New Mexico based on all of the experiences that you've touched on. And I think that people really, I am a therapist, I am a social worker, but I also totally agree with and hear what Carmen is saying about the helping professions. Like, it can be really stuffy, and I have to work through that myself because of the way that I was trained. And especially when people are experiencing something as powerful as grief, they need a space to be for real. And I need to be able to be real with them. And that, I think, is very healing. Gotcha.
All right, we want to, I guess, pursue this angle a little more, in as much as grief does look different on everyone. And Kendra, I'm going to bring you in as much as we want to do a quote here from something you were involved with. You shared some insights for an article in Briar Patch magazine titled "The Pressure to be Cured." And here's an excerpt from that piece. What's missing from this look at loss is what's most important, the things that kept people in grief for more than a year. For example, did the grieving person have a place to live, food, money, and friends during this challenging time? Why do they need to, quote, get over the many social and political problems that keep them in a state of grief? How does one's socioeconomic status factor into the experience of grieving? Kendra, that's for you.
Yeah, that's a great point, because socioeconomic status is basically based on your status as a worker in society and your ability to produce in society. So it relates also to what type of grief would be tolerated by your bosses and your work environment and society at large. And by that, I mean how much money and time that you would have for grieving. So this also requires a level of compliance and the expectation that this will be complemented with doctor's validation that you are indeed grieving and you need this time off, and the expectation that you will eventually suppress your grief, or that the grief will come to an end. And if there isn't this compliance to these social expectations dependent on a person's socioeconomic status, there is the potential for job loss, for loss of support, of social status, and ultimately of shame. So in that sense, socioeconomic status has a real bearing on who can essentially afford the time to grieve.
Carrie, obviously we are talking to four women here on the program tonight. And so I suppose I should ask whether or not men and women, well, we know they grieve differently. How do they grieve differently?
This is a great question. And I think my hope is that we start to shift away from this idea of men's grief versus women's grief, although they're different. We also know that gender is along a continuum. So I suspect that our understanding of masculine versus feminine grief will likely shift, and it needs to shift. What I can offer instead is Doka and Martin did some research a number of years ago on this idea of intuitive versus instrumental grief. And so those intuitive grievers are the ones who want to speak more about it. They might express their emotions more freely and really have a need to work through some of those pieces that we often refer to as the grief work, or some of those expressive pieces that Cassandra was saying. In terms of instrumental grievers, those are the grievers that in various theoretical models would be more, they engage in more restorative activities or rebuilding different aspects of their lives now that the person that they loved is gone, or the various losses they've experienced. They learn to adapt to them. So rather than masculine and feminine or male and female, there's this broader understanding of how people do things either through an emotional process or a restorative process. Research shows that most people will do a bit of both.
Cassandra, can you follow up on that? When you treat people, do you have to treat men differently from women when you counsel on grief?
My short answer is usually. And I also want to echo what was said about gender existing on a continuum. So I think of it more so in terms of how a person has been socialized. We live in a very socially binary world, unfortunately, still. And so someone who was socialized as male, regardless of what their gender identity is, may have been taught that it is not okay to engage with some of those more expressive pieces. And there are really deep-seated emotions about it. And someone who was socialized as female, while I think we kind of stigmatize grief in general, can have a little bit more access to those expressive parts or those emotions. And so I think of it as looking at how a person is socialized in context with where they're at, and then really figuring out what will be best in terms of developing a broader access to those emotions that need to be expressed.
Carmen, how about in your world? A difference between men and women in the way you do things?
Yes, it's actually quite interesting. So a lot of the work that we do is not just for racialized folks, but we do a lot of LGBTQ specific work. So I agree with the speakers in the sense that, yes, we can work differently for men and women. One of the things that we've noticed from our participants is that oftentimes men may take a few, meetings to really be able to open up. But regularly speaking, like, women are more open to talk about their feelings. And a lot of the questions we get is a lot of men say, I don't even know how to express what I'm feeling. And so that is something that comes up quite a bit. But again, we have quite a range of genders and gender identities. So it is quite a mix, but that is definitely a thread that goes along all of our talks. A lot of men just saying, I wasn't ever equipped or given the tools to express what this profound loss feels like for me.
Kendra, I admit I probably spend too much time in the world of politics, but in that world, if you're a male and you show emotion, even if you cry in public, nowadays it's considered quite ennobling. And if you're a woman trying to run for president and you shed a tear because something has affected you, it's often considered a deal breaker. And it's obviously there've been a lot of theories as to why Hillary Clinton was considered so unsympathetic by so many Americans. Because she didn't show emotion in public until that one time when she was running against Obama. Anyway, I'm off on a bit of a tangent there, but maybe you could jump in and talk about the double standards that we still seem to have as it relates to dealing with grief between men and women.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think it has a larger component to it in the historical understanding of women as emotional or irrational beings. So there's this expectation or maybe leeway to women expressing these emotions, but that's not as to say that women will be respected for expressing these emotions. So it's about a bit of a paradox in which they're permitted to express these emotions, but it also comes at the risk of being perceived as less rational or perhaps less serious. So in the context of grief, yes, it's true the fact that men do perhaps not allowed the space to express their emotions in the way that women would be permitted to. But I would argue that with that comes also the prejudices against women for expressing their emotions and the expectation that they're not as rational or, in the context of politics, not as dependable.
So my sense of it, you are agreeing with my sense of the unfairness of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gotcha. All right. I want to circle back to the sort of pathologizing of grief that we talked about earlier, because earlier this year, prolonged grief disorder was officially recognized by the American Psychiatric Association as a mental health condition. And here's an excerpt from their report on this. According to the APA, symptoms of prolonged grief disorder include emotional numbness, intense emotional pain and loneliness, identity disruption, and disbelief about the person's death. The formal recognition of the disorder, so says the APA, will help medical professionals be properly reimbursed for providing medical care. It will also help researchers secure funding to research the condition. Okay, Cassandra, let me just get your take on that conclusion that the APA's come to.
Okay, well, it's certainly very nuanced. And if we are to, we certainly don't have time for a whole entire conversation about the DSM and diagnosis in general and the facts that we rely so heavily on it. However, I do want to point out that being reimbursed as someone who is speaking to people and trying to aid people in integrating these experiences for a living is a huge issue. And many insurance companies require you to provide a diagnosis in order to make a living. And so while I don't agree with labeling people and saying, this is your diagnosis in a way that is limiting to them, I do agree that there is a larger social context in which sometimes we provide diagnosis to be able to continue seeing people or for people to get benefits they need, social services, time off of work, unfortunately, things like that.
Kendra, can you weigh in on that?
Well, I think it points to a larger structural issue that we have to be labeling people and pathologizing people in order for the people who are helping them, clinicians, to help them to be able to reimburse for the work that they're doing with them. I think this points to the fact that psychotherapy should be affordable to all people, should be accessible to all people, should be free to all people, and that it shouldn't be based on the wants or the income of insurance companies to diagnose people.
Carrie, what have you found in your research, I think this would be very helpful to know, about what the difference is among people? Let's say a person loses a parent. One person, person A, can be back on the job 2 days later, functioning perfectly fine and dealing with the grief of that in their own particular way. Somebody else might need 3 months off work or more because they just cannot function with the loss of that parent. Why such a gap?
That's such a great question. And I also feel like this could be a conversation we have for many, many hours, but I'll do my best to answer briefly. When someone experiences a death-related loss for which there is this grief process, it's informed by so many other factors. As somebody mentioned on the panel already, grief doesn't occur in a vacuum. It is socially constructed by the norms and the values of what's happening at that time. And so if somebody has previous experiences with loss or different traumas in their lives that pre-existed this death experience, if there are attachment-related concerns, right? Grief is mediated through the attachment system and how people are able to form secure attachments. And so if there are insecure attachments, that may play out in their grief trajectory. Other issues such as poverty, racism, violence, other socio-political realities can also affect how someone navigates that grief trajectory. So it's not just the death of that person, but so many other factors. Have they now lost their home? Do they need to move? Is there financial strain? Are there other health-related experiences that they're dealing with at this time? And so some of those secondary losses are often more prevalent day to day in the adjustment following the death, in addition to the grief and mourning over the person who's been lost.
That really does describe very well the multi-layered differences, I guess, among different people. Yeah, we don't all start on the same starting line when somebody dies. There is so much that goes into it. And Carmen, maybe you could pick up the story and talk about the role of the community, the role of the broader community in the process of mourning and grieving.
Yeah, for sure. Well, for us, I mean, our understanding is different in the sense that, yes, we recognize that for practical reasons, the DSM will have labels for people in terms of just financial reasons. But for us, the way we see it is that community should be first for a lot of us, especially racialized folks. And I think anybody who lives in Canada can really understand that it can sometimes be irresponsible to assume that a professional should be the first person you go to when I am a social worker as well. I have my master's in social work, and I've also worked in the mental health industry, racialized mental health. And there are just such a lack of supports for folks. And so asking them to go to a professional first when that can take 18 months, when there is profound racism that occurs in the healthcare system, which we have seen in Canada, especially recently, when there is profound ableism and pathologizing of racialized people, is just not necessarily the first place you want to go to for support, nor should it be. And we believe in kind of divesting from this idea that you need to go to a professional first. And we don't discourage people from going to a psychiatrist or social worker, but we do feel that we need to have a better understanding of how we as a community can support each other. Because before there were all of these professions created, who supported grievers? We did as communities. And so let's find a way to do that. And that's really important for us, even if it means like figuring out food to drop off to people, figuring out childcare for folks. That's also something like, can we do free childcare so you can just grieve, so you don't have to be worrying about making food for your little one? Can we figure out how to kind of take care of your elderly parents while you're dealing with the loss of somebody else? How do we really support each other in this? And it's really about coming together collectively and kind of figuring out what folks need and making that kind of a network of support where we can be there for each other without expecting financial compensation for it.
Right. We're down to our last couple of minutes here, and I don't know how many of the four of you have listened to Anderson Cooper's new podcast. It's all about grief, and it's actually quite good. He was on the other day with Stephen Colbert, who, of course, a late-night CBS talk show host in the United States. And Colbert talked about losing his father and two brothers in a plane crash back in 1974. And he said, I was personally shattered, and then you kind of reform yourself in this quiet, grieving world that was created in the house. You get the awareness of other people's loss, which allows you to connect with that other person, which allows you to love more deeply and to understand what it's like to be a human being. Cassandra, we got a couple of minutes left here. Can I just get you to weigh in on the value of that advice that Stephen Colbert gave in that interview?
Yeah, I haven't listened to that yet, but now I'm excited to. I think that's a really beautiful quote. And I think he absolutely has some great insight. Like, even as a helping professional, we've had some conversations about that, so I'm putting air quotes around it. It's important for me to be in touch with the grief and the losses in my own life, to really show up for people and be able to connect with them in their experience. And it also reminds me of what Carmen was saying about the community aspect of things and how a lot of what I'm doing is really encouraging people to get in touch with community and in touch with themselves and invest in that, because that is going to be integral to their healing process, much more so than sitting in a vacuum with me and talking forever. To really connect with those outside resources is so important.
I want to thank the four of you for sharing your tremendous wisdom with our viewers and listeners here on TVO tonight. Cassandra Glenn, Carrie Arnold, Carmen Galvin, Kendra McLaughlin. Really good of you to spend so much time with us all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tomorrow on the agenda,
You can look around Toronto especially, and you can see all of these things, but you don't realize that back in the day, so many oddball things happened at places like Varsity Stadium, where they auctioned off all the provincial government cars when Mitch Hepburn was premier. Or
he was the Trump of the 1930s.
He
right?
was the Trump.
Big populist politician.
And McCullough, getting back to the radio, realized that you could do this. You could be this populist leader. And we're still talking about a man who's 31, 32 years old. And he's buying radio time all over the country. And at one point in one of his radio speeches, he says these words about how powerful he is, that, you know, you can get behind me, I'm going to be this great leader.
That's tomorrow on the agenda. Social media platforms such as TikTok and Instagram make finding almost anything possible. That increasingly includes people looking for help and community sharing or oversharing difficult emotions, suffering, and feelings of trauma. Is that good and useful? Or might it be toxic and an impediment to healing? With us to consider all of that in Fort Worth, Texas, Shannon Thomas. She's a certified clinical trauma specialist and author of Healing from Hidden Abuse. In Calgary, Alberta, Simone Saunders, trauma therapist and online content creator. And here in our studio, Huma Sadie, therapist and director at Cedarway Therapy. Huma, thank you for coming into our studio today, and to our friends in Points Beyond. We're glad you could join us on the agenda tonight as well. Let's just all make sure we understand what we're talking about. Trauma, Huma, is defined as what?
Trauma is something that is extremely upsetting or distressing as an experience, but it's important to note that what's traumatic for you might not be traumatic for me. And even more so, it's important to note is just because something is traumatic doesn't mean that you're having trauma symptoms as a result. So, for example, if you've been in a serious traumatic car accident, you might not develop trauma symptoms as a result.
So it's a very personalized thing.
Yes, 100%.
Gotcha. Simone, maybe you could follow up on this term that we are hearing now, trauma dumping. What is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So trauma dumping is any sort of unsolicited oversharing of trauma to people who don't necessarily consent to it.
Okay, and let's go on with this. We want to bring up a little graphic here that shows some of what you've just referred to. TikTok videos, for example, with hashtags that say trauma dump and trauma dumping have more than 20 million accumulated views. And if we go to Instagram, there are 4.1 million posts with the hashtag trauma and more than 415,000 with childhood trauma. Okay, Shannon, pick up the story there. How did social media become the dumping ground, if you will, for people sharing their traumatic incidents?
Well, you know, it's a great question. It's kind of a phenomenon that's just come into play. I think it was in 2018 that the term was first coined, because somebody was sharing what was going on in their life and people hopped on, and rather than commenting about what the person had shared, they took it in a completely different direction and started sharing all kinds of really intimate aspects of trauma that they had experienced. And it has become difficult to be able to differentiate between what is real trauma happening for people and what sort of bandwagon trauma, where we're desensitizing the whole concept of experiencing really difficult things in life.
Simone, maybe you could pick up on that. Does this kind of trauma dumping, this sharing or in some cases oversharing, does it actually empower people in your experience?
Oftentimes I found that a lot of people can find camaraderie and find community in some of these pieces, because I think that the benefit of social media is that a lot of people have similar experiences, and they're being able to find other people who have some of those experiences and feel a little bit less isolated. So I think that I've seen kind of both sides to it, and I think that there is a lot of good in it as well.
Huma, what's your view on that?
I think it's important for particularly the consumers of the trauma dumping to be careful, as what trauma dumping really is, it's one-sided. It's somebody kind of dumping their trauma onto you, literally, and that can lead to consequences. So I think it's important that if you're following someone that does that regularly, you need to consider if that's healthy for you and it's okay for you to take that regularly.
I mean, the expression itself, trauma dumping,
Yes.
It sounds like a pejorative expression. It does not sound like a positive thing.
No, it's another word for toxic venting, essentially, right? So it's something that's one-sided, there's often not consent of the other person receiving that information. So it may be helpful for the person doing it, but it might not be the best experience for the person receiving it.
Shanna, can you weigh in on that as well?
Yeah, I'm a trauma therapist and I see clients still in full-time practice, and I don't find trauma dumping empowering. It's not leading to people getting help. What it's leading to is people hop online, and we're talking about people in a certain generation. I think we've got a generation gap happening as well. So we've got younger, generally, people going online, sharing really intimate, very, very difficult things that have happened to them, but then they're not leading it to anything that's empowering towards health, towards restoration, towards finding therapeutic resources. What we're happening, though, we're seeing is people just saying what's happened to them, but not being empowered. Actually, we've watched people sobbing online, sobbing on these TikTok videos, and or dancing to common pop music, where now the traumatization has become really desensitized. So I'm actually on the other side, seeing clients all day long in private practice therapy, and I do not find that trauma dumping is at all empowering. There's a real difference between an education campaign, which is grounded, and here, this is what I've gone through, and here's how I got through it, and here's how you can get through it. Trauma dumping is actually quite the opposite.
Simone, in that case, would you urge people not to do it?
Yeah, I would think that I agree that there definitely needs to be some safety around your consumption of social media. What are you consuming? How is it impacting you? And around the things that you are disclosing online as well. I think that it's important to remember that, people have sensitivities, triggers, and it can be very difficult to hear. And vicarious trauma is also a thing. So just being mindful of how much you're sharing and what you are sharing.
Okay, mindful is one thing, but would you actually advise people that they should not do it because ultimately it is not helpful?
I think that that's a nuanced answer. I think that, again, it depends on the severity and exactly what you're talking about.
Okay, fair enough. Huma, how about this? I mean, if these are becoming, this trauma sharing, maybe oversharing in some cases, if you start setting it to music, and you start dancing to it on TikTok, or doing whatever people do on TikTok to give it kind of an artistic flair, is it turning into something else?
I think it can sometimes feel like it's becoming entertainment and to kind of garner more likes. And I think it's important for content creators to be aware of why they're sharing what they're sharing. Is it to the shock, the awe, to get more likes, or is it to actually work on healing or to help others? And I think that is really important to kind of go back to what is your intention about sharing this?
I don't mean this to sound like a naive question, but are there lots of people out there who do this just because they want to get likes? They just want the attention?
I think, unfortunately, yes. I do think there's a lot of good, positive content creators out there, but as with any, platform, anything that there is, there are still some bad apples out there.
Simone, how about you? Can you say whether or not, in your experience, there's too much attention-seeking and not necessarily appropriate catharsis going on here?
I think that sometimes there is a lot of oversharing on social media, and that can definitely be harmful. And at times, unfortunately, it can be for likes. At other times, I think it's important, like Uma said, to really understand the intentionality behind sharing things.
Okay, let's bring up this quote here because we have somebody who has spoken to this. While trauma dumping may act as a cathartic release for some users, and online spaces can feel like a safe place to do so, experts warn it can also have detrimental effects for both the dumper and the dumpee. There's a term I haven't heard before, okay, dumpee. Okay, Shannon, you want to weigh in on that? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. And I think part of what the risks are is that with the algorithms of TikTok in particular, you will get into an echo chamber. So we've got young people, young adults, getting into this echo chamber of trauma. And, recently we talked about influencers and their intentionality of that. I happened to see a beachside influencer in a very, very beautiful home talking about not getting out of bed, being too depressed to get out of bed. Well, I can tell you somebody was getting out of bed because that house had to be paid for. And all of those expenses had to be paid for. And what I felt like in that moment is I felt manipulated. I felt like this person was buying into the sort of the modification or the money-making aspect of mental health. And, oh, I'm so depressed I can't get out of bed, while living in a multi-million-dollar home. And what's happening is that people, that are not living in multi-million-dollar homes and are not influencers are emulating this. I can't get out of bed. I'm too depressed. I'm too overwhelmed. I'm too traumatized. And now we're having a generation that's lacking in functionality. And I'm actually deeply concerned about where this is all going on TikTok with this particular generation.
Okay, but Simone, let me get you back in here and speak to the other side of the coin, where let's take at face value that there are good faith efforts out there by people who really want to make a difference not only in their own lives but in other people's lives as well. What does that kind of content look like, and how does it become constructive?
I think just having boundaries around it. So again, I think that goes back to intentionality. Why are you sharing what you're sharing? What are you following up with? Are you following up with resources? And I think that there's people who kind of share their everyday life, and some of that is including, experiences of depression or anxiety or what have you. And I think that that's something that can also sometimes be helpful too, because I think that depression and anxiety is a wide spectrum, and being rich or famous or whatever it is doesn't necessarily exclude you from those experiences.
No, in fact, quite the contrary sometimes. You wonder, you're surrounded by all this richness and yet you're still feeling miserable and depressed, and you wonder how that makes sense. Okay, I get you on that. Huma, I like your Instagram account. Muslim Trauma Therapist. Sums it all up right there.
Yes, it does.
Which raises for me the question of whether or not we have to look at some of this through a cultural lens, because there are presumably distinctions among different communities here. Fill us in on that.
So while there are many similarities between communities, I think what we know is there are a lot of significant nuances. And for me, one of the biggest shifts that I've seen on social media, and I've been in the field for many years, is the diversity of the voices from different racialized and cultural communities. Because when I was in school, everything I was taught and who I was taught by was from a Eurocentric perspective. And there are nuances, and not everyone has access to culturally and racially diverse content. And it really can help people feel seen and heard by getting that and knowing that they're not alone.
Fill in the blanks a little more on that, because, some people watching this or listening to this may think, depression is depression. It doesn't matter if you're Muslim or Christian or Jewish or whatever. Depression's depression. How is it different among different communities?
I think it can help people understand sometimes some of the reasons why. So maybe my family background is different than your family background, which can help inform things, whether it be intergenerational trauma that happens, to help people feel less odd or unique. I find that in social media, people can kind of see that they're not alone. There are other people that have had similar experiences to them, and that there is a way out of this. And having strategies and skills that are tweaked with cultural and spiritual nuance, I think, is very important.
Is that to say, one more follow-up for you, is that to say that you think you've got a better shot at helping, let's say, a Muslim 17-year-old girl dealing with the kinds of issues we've been discussing, than somebody who's not a Muslim therapist?
I think it depends on the person, right? So I think for some clients, I really do think for them, it's probably better if they don't see a Muslim therapist. I think for others, it actually increases the likelihood that they're going to find a connection. And studies show the best predictor of treatment outcome is that connection you have between the therapist and the client. So for me, the biggest thing is there needs to be options out there for individuals. And what makes me really happy in the last several years is there's a lot more diverse therapists and options available, so people can have that choice.
And would most of the people that you treat be Muslims as well?
I would say the majority are currently in my private practice.
Majority are,
Yeah.
Okay. Simone, same question to you. Do you think you've got a better shot at helping young black kids with whatever issues they're dealing with right now because you share that bond?
Yeah, I would also echo what Uma said. I think that really the relationship is the biggest piece. And I think if you're especially dealing with something like racial trauma, a lot of times it can be helpful to have a therapist that is a racialized person. I think it's also important to remember that, a variety of therapists can be culturally responsive, but I think that connection to culture is really, really important and integral in the therapy journey, regardless of what you're choosing to work on.
Well, Shannon, I should get you to weigh in on that as well. Is that to say, Shannon, that you think you may not have as good a shot at Simone as Simone would in dealing with, let's say, a young 17-year-old black girl who's dealing with issues?
Well, I think it really depends on what the client needs. You know, we come from a client-centered perspective. And if the client needs somebody that is going to understand certain aspects of their culture, certain aspects of how family dynamics work within the community, then I think that's what is we're going to go with. We're going to go with what the client needs. For me, I see a wide range of clients from a variety of different backgrounds, different races, different ethnicities, demographics, because I specialize in healing from hidden abuse, which is a psychological abuse, a trauma. And having a trauma-informed therapist who understands the hidden abuse aspects, that cuts across a lot of different demographics. And so they want to come to someone who's going to understand the type of abuse that isn't typically talked about. So I do see a wide range of clients, but it's really about what they need. I literally asked the client the other day, am I what you need, or do you want assistance to help to find someone who fits more of what you're looking for and what your needs are at this time? And they were really honest about it, and we worked together to find what was the best fit.
Okay, you've opened that door, so I'm going to go through it. That person that you've just described, obviously, don't give us any name or anything like that,
No.
but in terms of other identifying factors, what cultural background were they, what community were they from, that kind of thing?
Similar background as far as a culture, similar background of ethnicity. But what was different was that their trauma was from a parent, and I'm about that parent's age. And so I asked this individual, am I the right therapist, or is there going to be some difficulty in being that I'm the same gender, I'm around the same age? Would you prefer to work with a younger therapist that you would relate to in sort of a different, maybe subconscious way? And actually the choice was no, to go ahead and to stay working with someone that is of my age, but can then work through what was needed to work through from a trauma perspective, but from a voice of someone who is in their early 50s.
So they were, at the end of the day, they were okay with you being the person?
Yes, but if they weren't, that was okay too, because we really want people to be in a spot that's right for them. And I wanted to open that space for that individual to be honest with what they needed.
Okay. Simone, can you take us through some of your clientele? What kinds of backgrounds do they come from?
Yeah, I would say that primarily the population that we see at my practice is, I would say probably between 80 and 85% racialized folks.
And do you feel sort of particularly able to speak to and connect with that group of people because you share that common bond?
Yeah, I definitely think that some of the experiences that you have as a racialized person, those are experiences that you're able to share with other racialized people in a special way. Is that always what people are going to need? Absolutely not. But I think that sometimes when that is what you need, there is that special bond there.
And what about the circumstance that Shannon just described? Let's say the person in question might be an older sister who's around your age and who knows, may even look a bit like you. Do you find yourself in that set of circumstances where you might not be the right person?
Yeah, I think there's definitely always clients that will come and then it just might not be the right fit. And I think it's your job as a professional to open up that conversation, make sure that the client feels comfortable enough to talk with you about those things, and then refer them to whoever the best person is, or work on whatever relationship, balance issues there might be at the time.
Huma, can you tell us whether you think this generation of young people who are, as they say, digital natives, as opposed to digital immigrants, right? The iPhone has been a feature of their lives from as far back as they can remember. Are they particularly susceptible to, well, I don't know if the director can catch this shot, but there's a shot on the big wall behind us here. There it is, right there. I mean, I've seen that image 100 times on the subway, among friends of my daughter. Is this generation particularly susceptible to all of this because they're digital natives?
I think what's really important is they may be more susceptible. That does not need to be the full story, though. I think there's a lot of education that can happen around this by their caregivers, their parents, the schools, in terms of what are appropriate boundaries to have with social media, with our phones, because it has in many ways also opened up many more opportunities, it has reduced barriers. So while COVID has been horrible in many ways, it has actually reduced barriers to accessing treatment or mental health content on social media. So while there is a lot of bad parts of, being a digital, nomad, there's also a lot of positive aspects. And I think just working with the educational piece is really important for this generation.
You're a mother?
Yes, I am.
How many kids you got?
3.
How old are they?
16, 13, and 10.
Oh, they are in the absolute
they're right in there.
sweet and or miserable spot
Yes.
of everything that we're talking about here. All right, how do you handle all this?
I actually think it's really important as a parent that I am on social media, because it's very hard to help them navigate this, go through boundaries, and have those conversations that are both serious as well as lighthearted without me being on social media. So I do think for me as a parent, it is important to kind of be there in it with them.
Do you monitor what they send out and take in?
I do. I do at this age still have access to their social media accounts.
Do they know that?
Yes, they do.
What do they think about that?
They knew that was part of the arrangement when they were able to get this, and that this is not about trust. It is really around helping them navigate what is out there, making sure what comes in at them, they're able to navigate, and having conversations about that.
Now, your 2 older ones, I would think in particular right now, are especially susceptible to all of the dangers that we're talking about, because that's the age, right? They're at the age, and they no doubt have friends who are going through a lot of these difficulties right now. Do you have enough hours in the day to stay on top of all this? I mean, it's a fire hose of stuff coming at you.
I will say it is very difficult to be on top of it, and I think as parents and as caregivers, we need to understand is we can't always be there right in the moment with them. But what we can do is do our best to help them navigate, and having that door open for them to come to us or other caregivers or adults that are in their lives, so they feel comfortable coming to individuals to ask those questions about, is this okay? What about this content? Is this trauma dumping? Is that normal? What's going on to have that?
Shannon, how personal does this get for you?
Yeah, it gets very personal because as a Gen Zer, or I'm a Gen Xer. I'm raising a Gen Zer who is in their late teens and early 20s, and I actually have a different perspective. I think that when it comes to TikTok, the voices of their peers are very much overshadowing the voices of what's happening at home, and that's not just a personal experience. I think that's what I'm seeing from a lot of my clients as well, and what I'm hearing among mom friends is that a lot of these youth are now raising each other in some ways, because our voices as parents can be a little bit overdrawn or outshadowed by a lot of the voices that are happening online. They're going to TikTok as a Google. When they're wanting to learn new things, they're TikToking and seeing different videos from people giving them opinions. And so what's happening is a lot of times what's going on at home is not what's raising a lot of children when it comes to the different foundations that are happening once we get into the social kind of natives and social nomads no more, that they are truly there living it. And those are the voices that are overriding a lot of what's happening within their families and generations of families.
I think we should see some of what we're talking about here. And we just happen to have some of Simone's work standing by. So Simone, we're going to take a look at some of what you've put out there, and then we'll come back and chat. Mr. Director, if you would.
The message here is not to normalize unhealthy boundaries or controlling behavior just based off of culture. The message is to understand that culture plays a large role in your ability to set what is typically considered healthy boundaries. Once you're able to understand the nuance that comes with being a racialized person, then you can look at solutions that will be helpful for you based on your specific situation.
Okay, Simone, tell us why you put that out there.
Yeah, so that video, I believe, was in response to a video that I stitched from another creator. And the other creator essentially was talking about how, because of her, cultural identity, she had different boundaries, so to speak, with her family, which a lot of, Western or European, from a European perspective, might be too controlling or too kind of too helicoptery, so to speak. And so I was just talking about the fact that, in a lot of different cultures, family dynamics will look different. And I think that it's important to remember that and important to decide for yourself, okay, in terms of my own cultural identity, I don't necessarily have to take kind of westernized ideas and say like, okay, I'm going to cut my parents off or whatever that advice might look like. It might just look like, okay, how do I feel comfortable in this dynamic, knowing the cultural pieces that are really important to me and really important in my family dynamic.
And what kind of response did you get to the video?
I got a lot of responses from racialized people saying that that really resonates with them. They really agree. It's really difficult sometimes to take some of the mainstream advice and apply it to their own cultural contexts.
I presume you got some critical reaction as well?
Oh, absolutely.
And what did that look like?
I think that there were people that were saying that the video that I had stitched, that's abusive, that's toxic, that's this and that. And while I can totally understand and empathize that from a perspective where you haven't experienced a lot of that cultural nuance, it might definitely feel that way. But I think, again, it's really important to understand that coming from a cultural background, you really have to understand what those boundaries might look like, and it might look a little bit different for people, and that's okay.
Simone, do you ever get concerned that in your good faith attempt to put education and information out there, in effect, all you do is raise a red flag to all of the haters, and you know, it defeats the purpose at the end of the day?
No, not really, honestly, because I think, first of all, I've gotten a lot of great feedback on it. And I think that for me, a large part of my goal is, you know, destigmatizing BIPOC mental health. And I think that in having a lot of these conversations, that's contributing to that, because these conversations are things that we don't necessarily have in our communities because mental health is so stigmatized in a lot of racialized communities.
Huma, last word to you on this. Are we at a point yet where social media can replace therapy?
Definitely not. I think there's benefits when it comes to social media and mental health content. Education is power, and not everyone has access to this type of information and weren't raised with learning that. However, therapy is completely different. It's an individual relationship that you have that's very special with somebody that's built on trust and intimacy. It's different than what you have with your family and your friends, and it's nourished over time. It should be a space where that client should be able to tell their therapist anything and do so without judgment. And they're able to work on individualized goals, to work on things that they want to work on improving about themselves.
Well, I want to thank the three of you for joining us on TVO tonight. This was most illuminating. Shannon Thomas in Fort Worth, Texas, Simone Saunders in Calgary, Alberta, Huma Sadie here in our studio in Toronto. Thank you very much, you three. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Monday, October 17th, 2022. How's this for a provocative question? With all the news being war, pandemic, and economic turmoil these days, is it time to stop watching the news? We'll debate that tomorrow. Also, historian Mark Burry on the blazing rise and dramatic fall of the 20th century Canadian media mogul, George McCullough. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.